Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Henry Hale. I'm director of the Institute for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies and also of our Petroc program on Ukraine. And we are delighted here to have back to the Institute Serhiy Kudelia, who at one point in time was a postdoctoral fellow here, and we really benefited from the time that he spent with us. So we missed him here, but it's been great to see him go on and do terrific things, including this really very impressive book. So I want to say, first of all, congratulations on important work. And we are very pleased that you've agreed to come here to talk about it with our community. Serhiy is an associate professor of political science at Baylor University and an author of a lot of very important and interesting, I would say, books and articles, chapters on Ukraine, comparative politics, issues related to conflict, elite politics, and what have you. So I think without further ado, let me just turn things over to you, and so he can lead off with a discussion of the main themes he wants to highlight in the book, and then we will open it up for general discussion. So okay. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Henry, and thank you everyone for coming to this talk. I see some familiar faces here, so I'm glad to see you here. Yes, I was here about 15 years ago, I think, for a postdoctoral position, and I would never imagine that I would be researching topics related to war. I was actually studying political institutions and democracy, autocracy. We were all talking about Yanukovych at those times. This was the problem. Yanukovych was the problem. Now we have some really more serious problems than Yanukovych. This research is really based, or this book is based on the research that began right as the conflict began in 2014, when I got drawn into the study of the origins of the conflict, and then engaged in more detailed field research, going back and forth to Donbas and researching various dimensions of this conflict. My book is based, or each chapter in the book starts with a story. So I want to tell you a little story from the book, and then connect it to the general arguments. The town of Dobropilya is about 20 miles from a major center of agglomeration called Pokrovsk. This town is about 20,000 people. It's basically a mining town. The largest employer there is the Tech, which is the Akhmetov-based miners, minefield. And when I was doing research in other towns of Donbas, I never heard of Dobropilya, somebody told me that you should go to this town. Because what you will do is you will encounter people who engaged in a very different type of response from what you've seen so far. And that is, they were engaged in open resistance. And so I was very interested in going and seeing how exactly it happened. I found contacts for one of the people who were engaged in the self-defense group, and he was willing to talk to me. He invited me over to his office, and when I arrived, I saw the small room full of men, about 25 men. They were all sitting at the long table, and they were ready to talk to me. And the surprising part, of course, was that they were so interested in sharing their story and in telling the details of how they organized the self-defense group. It was very difficult to keep track of what they were saying. They were all trying to interrupt each other and speak at the same time. But this story, and I talk about Dobropilya in great detail in the book, in the separate chapter devoted to resistance to separatism, highlighted one of the most interesting findings I had from my research. And that is, when we think about the beginning of the conflict in 2014, we think of maps where, usually Ukrainian government maps, where most of Donbas is sort of painted in the same color as occupied. And then as the counter-offensive or the offensive operations of the Ukrainian troops went on through the summer of 2014, that territory was shrinking. In fact, much of the territory that was painted as occupied was never occupied or was never controlled by the militants. And when I was entering many of the towns and started talking to the civilians about their experience, many of them said, we never saw armed people in our towns. So that was one of the most interesting initial incentives for me to start exploring the reasons for this variation and try to understand to what extent certain towns were more controlled coercively than others, and to what extent these towns were actually administered from Donetsk by separatist authorities, or they were still administered from Kiev by the Ukrainian authorities. It also, this experience that I had with this group of people whom I then met several times, highlighted also the need to conduct field research. Because a lot of what has been written so far about the conflict in Donbas is written from the perspective of several major cities, Donetsk, Luhansk, Moscow, Kiev, but in fact, a lot of what has happening, important things that have been happening during this beginning phase of the conflict have been happening on a much localized level of smaller towns. There is, of course, a lot of interest in Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, but people tend to, or scholars tend to overlook other towns that were around Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, and they were very important, as I show in my book, to understand the mechanisms of the capture of the region. Finally, the example of Dobropil and that experience that I had also highlighted the extreme importance of local actors and the focus that we have to use to highlight the behavior and the choices that local actors made at the beginning of the conflict. As I show, local actors made different choices. Some of them chose to flee, some of them chose to collaborate, some of them chose to resist. And ultimately this accumulation or combination of these various different choices explain why, for example, in Donbas, so few militants from Russia managed to take over such a big region, while in towns or cities like Kharkiv or Odesa, this attempt failed. And so the last chapter of my book is about the choices that locals made in Odesa and Kharkiv that explain how these sets of choices ultimately led to the defeat of these militant or separatist challenges. Now, why are we still talking about 2014? And here I would suggest that we need to, I would like to emphasize a couple of points why 2014 is important. Of course, everyone now recognizes 2014 is the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and the title of my book agrees with that. But I think the experience of the full-scale Russian invasion of 2022, it makes our understanding of what happened in 2014 much more difficult. Because there is a natural tendency for us, when we think about Russian-Ukrainian war, to conflate these two events, these two outbreaks of conflict in 2014 and 2022, and to think of them as a Russian invasion, which to some extent is correct in the case of 2014, but there are also fundamental differences in the way that invasion was carried out in 2014, and there were differences in goals. There were differences in the types of actors that were involved in this invasion. And that's why it's important to distinguish between Russia's contribution to starting the armed conflict in 2014 and the contribution and the role that was played by local actors in 2014. Obviously, in the case of 2022, the role of local actors was negligent, minimal. But in 2014, as I demonstrate throughout my book, it was rather significant. There is also a tendency to view 2014 Russian covert invasion as a success. And if you read a recent report by the German intelligence agency, which talks about the possibility of the replication of 2014, sort of the Green Man invasion in the Baltic states, right, you can see that analysts today, thinking about possible strategies that Russian leadership can take, try to compare 2014 and project it into the future and think that maybe, given the success of the Russian covert invasion in Ukraine, they will try to replicate the same experience there. That completely ignores the context in which 2014 invasion happened, which, as I argue, political context, which enabled the success of those tactics that Russian agents use. And it also overlooks the difficulty that Russian actors actually had at that time, 2014, to have a sustained control over the territory controlled by the separatists. This difficulty ultimately led the Russians to dispense with the charade in August 2014 and send regular troops. So one of the important insights from 2014 is that ultimately, even though many of the factors for the Russian invasion were very favorable in 2014, local factors, they still could not fully carry out this operation without the backup of Russian regular troops. That invasion happened in August of 2014. And finally, a point that I think is worth making is that a lot of the academic studies that have been done on this region were based primarily on secondary sources, on newspaper analysis, on other reports. And I think my book highlights the importance of both localized knowledge, access to people who witnessed these events and experienced them, and reliance on primary sources like documents that I managed to acquire and video footage. I use a lot of, or analyzed a lot of video footage I acquired from the people who were on the ground, but also collecting it from the web. The origins and the approach of the book. Let me just summarize how the idea for the book emerged. So initially, my book emerged in response to my desire to research more the beginning, the causes of the conflict, the mechanisms through which the takeover happened. But ultimately, it grew into something bigger, and the major topics that I address, three major topics that I address in my book, deal with the conditions under which external intervention can trigger domestic insurgency or internal insurgency. Second, questions related to governance and separatist governance in the context of the insurgency campaign. And third, I talk a lot about the choices that civilians have in the context of the outbreak of the armed conflict, the choices and the strategies the local administrators use in response to separatist challenge, the choices that workers in factories, teachers in schools make when they're faced with this type of very unusual political shift or change that they're witnessing themselves. From the very beginning, it was difficult to think about design the research, primarily because a lot of what happened happened at the same time in multiple parts of Donbas, and a lot of it, of course, was covert intervention related to Russian involvement, and that led to some scholars conclude that we have to wait for history archives before we can actually figure out the role of Russia, which I disagree with. And in fact, one of the chapters in my book details on the granular level, with the focus on individual actors like Bezler or Girkin, how Russian actors mattered throughout the beginning of this conflict. But to establish the exact mechanisms that ultimately allowed so few Russian agents to take over such a huge region as Donbas, I decided to engage in disaggregation and analyze, rather than looking at the regional level, analyze each town separately. And so my field research was based on visits to individual towns, and I visited altogether over 20 towns, and attempt to reconstruct events associated with the capture of each town, or some of the towns were not captured, so how these locals responded to the challenge they heard from that happened in Donetsk and Luhansk, reconstruction of these events in an analytical narratives, and then trying to bring them together through the focus on several large themes that I just discussed. That, of course, required, as I said, a lot of individual interviews, which I organized, and each town that I write about, this was my rule, each town I write about, I visited. So most, the occupied parts of Donbas I do not discuss in my book, primarily because I felt that I would not be competent enough to talk about what happened in these towns and cities. And we can talk about the limitations that this imposes on the study, but I think the general argument is that the focus on Donbas was on towns was very important because Donbas, and that's often times forgotten, was the most, I would have to say, unfortunately, was the most urbanized region in Ukraine. It had 12 urban agglomerations, which were located in close proximity to each other. And each town or major town or the center of the agglomeration had a population size from 200,000 people to 1.5 million people. These are very significant towns if you think about it, 12 urban agglomerations. And so the book, the analysis in the book is based on the analysis of 5 agglomerations that were controlled by the government at the time when they conducted research. Unfortunately, most of them are now occupied by the Russian troops. So they included Slovyansk agglomeration, Bakhmut, Lysychansk agglomeration, Pokrovsk agglomeration, and Mariupol. I also visited several towns outside of these key agglomerations. And as I demonstrated in my book, this proximity of agglomerations, which I found fascinating as I started traveling around Donbas. I'm personally from Western Ukraine, where we don't have such a highly urbanized area, and so I'm used to very long distances before you hit another major town. There you literally go 15 minutes from one major town to another, and this proximity, as I understood and show in the book, was a very important structural precondition that enabled the spread of insurgency or the replication of the tactics used by Strelkov and Slovyansk across the region. That enabled so few people. Initially, there were quite a few Russian agents there. Really, Besler controlled Khorlivka, and Strelkov controlled Slovyansk, and there were a couple of their allies controlling neighboring towns. But this agglomeration town proximity enabled the small number of militants to project coercive power beyond the area of their immediate control. And I trace how, for example, Liman, which belongs to the Slovyansk agglomeration, it's about 30 minutes away from Slovyansk on the car, did not have Russian presence, did not have Russian agents. So when I was talking to the locals about who exactly was capturing the police station, who exactly was controlling the government, the city council, etc., they were naming me individuals who were local. There was a former Afghan veteran, there was a guy who worked in the forestry department of Liman, etc., etc. And so I had the list of these local guys, and so I said, why did you actually follow them? Like, okay, a bunch of guys came with arms, why was there no response from a much larger town? And the answer was they came with the support and the backing of Strelkov, and there was an understanding or assumption that if somebody does something to them, Slovyansk is nearby, and Strelkov can always send his men, as he did, by the way, later, and I also talk about that in the book, and sort of enforce that coercive control through the direct influence. So that was one way in which they managed to project this coercive influence over neighboring towns. And the implication of this was that there was a very uneven distribution of coercive control. And the further you actually went away from Khorlivka and Slovyansk, the less was the presence of the militants and the separatists, and the weaker was their control. And so Pokrovsk agglomeration, actually, which is further away from Slovyansk and Khorlivka, Pokrovsk agglomeration was never fully in control of the militants. There were a couple of towns that were more or less controlled by the local separatists, but really major towns, like I already mentioned, Dobropilya or Pokrovsk itself, were never really captured, even though they were marked on the Ukrainian maps, as Ukrainian government maps, as if they were controlled by the separatists. So in my book, this is one of the sort of conceptual, the conceptual framework that I'm using is the framework of 2 phases of the beginning of the conflict. One phase has to do with the state formation. In other words, when separatists remove successfully, or militants remove Ukraine's sovereign presence from these towns, partially or fully, and establish a certain degree of control coercively over these towns. And that stage of the state formation is usually symbolized by the removal of the Ukrainian flags, by sometimes the exit of the Ukrainian officials from these towns, Subordination of the city councils. Many of the city councils started voting along with what the separatists and militants wanted them to do, for example, authorizing the conduct of referendums. And in some towns, you actually had the takeover of the local media. So local newspapers would start being published with the logos of these quasi-separatist republics. And the second phase, which begins basically after the referendum, so-called referendum of May 11, 2014, is the state building phase, where militants start to govern these towns. And so the ability to continue governing these towns, being able to ensure continuity from the Ukraine to the separatist stage was a very significant element of the takeover of the regions, because it told the civilians that the costs associated with the separatist presence were rather low. And as I show in my book, and I already alluded to it in my talk, Russian agents played, in my view, central role at this initial stage of state formation. In other words, establishing coercive control over territories and towns, like Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, and Horlivka. But they also relied on pre-existing local networks of civilians who, like I just described in the case of Liman, who formed during the phase of the Euromaidan. Because remember, the insurgency or the armed conflict begins in April of 2014. Euromaidan ends at the end of February of 2014. But during the last Euromaidan month, that is January and February, Donbas experiences its own counter-mobilization against Maidan. That counter-mobilization is driven by the local officials who are organizing local defense groups. And so what happens is that when Russian agents arrive in April of 2014, they already have networks of mobilized locals, civilians, who have this experience of self-defense organization in February, whom they can draw on and use in order to ensure capture and then control over these individual towns. So I do not completely remove the significance of local civilian networks, separatist networks from this stage, but certainly Russians played a decisive role. On the other hand, the second stage, that is the stage of state building and governance, that's where, as I show in the book, the role of local actors like administrators, local mayors, city officials, business owners, teachers, principals of schools, etc., played a very significant role. And without their involvement, I think that state formation stage might not have been complete. What are some of the ways in which they mattered? So, of course, the organization of referendum, because imagine most of the people like Strelkov and others, Besler, who came to Donbas, Besler is a different story, but Strelkov and many others with Strelkov, they had no idea where they are. These were people who never visited Donbas before in their lives. They arrived in towns that they did not understand, and they needed local support in order to start controlling these towns and governing these towns efficiently. And of course, referendum had to be organized with the support of the people who had experience with organizing a referendum. So I show how some of the mayors, for example, were very proactive in organizing referendum. Other mayors were less active. They were forced, they were coerced. But ultimately it was organized with a lot of civilian help of local civilian officials. Locals provided a lot of financial resources to the militants. So many businessmen I met. I interviewed many businessmen in different towns, including Bakhmut. And they all told me about the same stories, where they were gathered by the militants in these big halls, and the militants said, you need to support Narodное ополчение, people's movement. And they told me, what should we do? What choices do we have? And so, yes, they provided a lot of resources. Some of them were providing them sincerely. Others were provided because they were coerced. But that was the choice that they made, to provide resources. There was also rhetorical support that I also detail in my book, public statements, rallies that were organized by local officials where they publicly call on supporting Donetsk People's Republic. Some of the mayors, again, were more active than others. There was no common type of response. But their role was also significant. And finally, ensuring governance continuity. So the fact that Public transportation was running on time. Buses were running on time. Schools were working. Hospitals were working. People were paid. All of that was very important to give certain degree of legitimacy to this new project. And I detail in a number of examples, and I specifically talk about the case of Lysychansk, where I managed to interview people who worked on the separatist side from the local administration who then fled to Russia, about their reasoning, why they were supporting or engaging in the separatist governance. And many of them did that absolutely sincerely. They were actually very proud to share these stories and memories about these times. So finally, and this is what I wanted to end with, talk a little about the evidence that I drew. And so I conducted over 100 interviews with people who lived in each of the towns that I discuss in the book. Many of the interviews were conducted with those locals who supported Ukrainian resistance to the separatists and supported pro-Ukrainian cause. Some of the interviews were conducted just with civilians who were not necessarily affiliated with one side or the other. And some of the interviews were also conducted with the separatists or with the leaders of the militia. I also collected a lot of data from the local newspapers. In each town, I went to the library, I read local newspapers, and that helped me to reconstruct the events in these towns. I collected footage from the rallies, city council meetings, and so on, and that helped me to build a bigger data set, and a lot of the evidence that I cite in the book is actually available on an outside Harvard Dataverse site where I deposited all of that information, all of these videos. You would need a special permission from me, authorization to access them. This was the condition that Harvard Dataverse had for me. They said we cannot post these videos, they're too sensitive. But in case you are interested to double check on everything I cite in my book, that's Harvard Dataverse. I will gladly provide you with access to these videos. But one important thing I wanted to mention at the end is that my intention, of course, was on one hand to provide analytical account of the conflict. This is academic book first and foremost. This is not a journalistic sort of impressionist book. So I am using analytical and theoretical frameworks and trying to make a theoretical contribution. But through multiple stories that I tell in the book, I also wanted to highlight the human side of the story. And what I think impressed me most is that, of course, it's easy to pass judgments on people at this stage and in general. But what I understood as I was talking to people in Donbas who made different choices, I understood that many of the people who were not interested in politics prior to 2014 and were suddenly politicized, they were faced with impossible dilemmas that even political scientists would not be able to solve with many years of our work and studies in the libraries. And that is, you're faced with multiple different narratives. And each of these narratives seems like it's the right one. And you have to make intuitive choices about what is right and what is wrong in a very difficult, complex, quickly changing situation, right? Where you don't really see how things will turn out in the future. And in this very highly volatile set of events, people sometimes made choices that they were sorry about. And sometimes they made choices that they were very proud of, right? But my intention was not to pass judgments on the people and on their choices, but to try to reveal and demonstrate the complexity of the situation and the complexity of the events that they were faced with in this period of Ukrainian history. And of course, ultimately, many people paid with their lives for the choices that they made. And this is a very important thing we have to remember, because people started losing their lives, civilians, very early on. And so I tell stories of, but the type of violence that they experienced was very different from the type of violence we hear about when we read the accounts of Bucha, for example, or other occupied cities in Russia. This is the type of violence that my colleague Jeffrey Kopstein talks about in his book, Intimate Violence. That is the violence that occurred between people who oftentimes knew each other for a long time and quite well. For example, in the town, when I went to the town of Le Mans, I met a man who was working at the railway station there, and he told me with documents a story about a family. One woman from this family was a Ukrainian language teacher in the local school, and one of her members of the class, his father was the leader of the local separatist group, self-defense group in Le Mans. And so after one of the classes, this man shows up in her class and he tells her, you have to stop teaching Ukrainian. That's it. Or we are going to do something to you. This is a father of the son that she has been teaching for many years, and he is making threats against the teacher. And after she refuses, she comes back home, and then they basically attack their house. They take her husband, and that husband is later, a few days later, found in a burned car, dead. Same story, a similar story from the town of Soledar, which is where there was a big salt mining, salt mine, one of the largest salt mines in Europe. And in that town, a member of the city council who tries to put back the Ukrainian flag on the city council and remove the separatist flag is again approached by a couple of people from the same town who knew him for a long time because he was the leader of the local trade union of that salt mining camp. And they first intimidate him, they put him in the car and they drive him with him away, and then I think like 8 months later or 10 months later they find the body of this man deep within one of the pits of the mines. These crimes were committed by people who knew each other, and this was one of the most horrific aspects of this beginning of the conflict. Because in a way, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily a civil war, if you want to ask me this question, I'm ready to address it, but we have to recognize that a lot of the violence and a lot of the killing happened between people who were quite close to each other. I want to end here, and because we are running out of time, and I would welcome your questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. All right, I think we have a lot of people here, so maybe what I'll do is just open it up straight away to people who may have questions or comments. Yes, please. If you just ask you to identify yourself, please. Thanks.
I'm Lilia Ostapenko, Serhiy's old friend. I'm a attorney here in DC. So I'm wondering, you did all those trips, were you ever scared for your personal safety? Because a lot of Ukrainians were captured and tortured and they never returned. So how did it go?
I mean, I was doing research in 2018, 2019. At that time, I think the closest I was to the front line was when I traveled around Bakhmut, and that's where the front line was pretty close. But in general, and that was an important observation, most of these towns were quite calm, and the life was going on normal. And I think by that time it was clear, I felt like this Donbas normalized. People got adjusted to living next to the front line, but because the intensity of the fighting was quite low, there was not a direct sense of war or threat of violence. It's also important to remember, 2022, when Putin claimed that that Ukrainians are trying to attack Donbas, in the preceding year, 2029, it had the lowest level of number of casualties from the conflict. I think the total number was about 16, which was the lowest for the entire conflict. So by that time, by 2021, that conflict really turned in a very low intensity type of war, which was not a real threat to the civilians who live there.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, comments? Yes, please.
Alexander, visiting scholar here. As one of the Kharkiv locals, I watched a lot of events in 2015, and including the capture of the Kharkiv regional administration building in March of 2014. So I'm interested in your explanation of Kharkiv case and Kharkiv exceptionalism. I mean, fail of the Kharkiv People's Republic in this year, especially compared with Lugansk and Donetsk case. So Kharkiv is a key region and key city in the east of Ukraine.
And the book also mentions Odessa, so maybe it'd be interesting to talk about that as well.
Yeah. So, thank you, Oksana. I had a chance to interview you when I was in Kharkiv, so now you're asking me the question. So what was interesting about Kharkiv, so of course we know about the role of Avakov. We know the decision early on to remove people from the city council. The significance of Azov, which was what it was called something else, was Patriot of Ukraine, was and so again, I'm not trying to pass judgment on the sides, but I think what put Kharkiv aside was you had a cursive counter mobilization led by people associated with Patriot of Ukraine and Biletsky, which engaged in direct fighting with the separatists. That by itself was quite unique. You did not have an experience of armed units in Donetsk or Luhansk that were trying to fight the separatists on the streets of Donetsk and Luhansk. Of course, it was quickly, they were quickly moved out of Kharkiv, and so what happened next, I think, and that's I detail in the book, is on one hand Avakov's decision to deploy riot police to remove people from the administrative building, but more importantly was the decision of now I remember only his mafia name, Kernes, right? You see this. So the decision of Gennady Kernes, right? Of Gennady Kernes to actually sabotage the whole separatist movement. And so I actually interviewed a number of people from Kharkiv who were on the separatist side. And I talked to them about how they organized rallies, how they thought of capturing mayor's building, because there was a second attempt to capture the mayor's building. And they all told me that we could have succeeded if Kernes sided with us, that this was really a decisive turning point. And so when I watched a number of videos with Kernes' participation, especially when there was a day when they organized a big march on the mayor's building, that was already after Avakov used Berkut to remove protesters from the city administration, it was very clear that Kernes managed to infiltrate a number of his agents in the separatist group who were organized to demobilize the separatists from within. And so there are several people, I can name them, they're named in the book, who actually appealed to this protesters and demonstrators trying to enter the city council to just go away and leave. And ultimately, what a number of people told me in the case of Odessa and in the case of Kharkiv. So in the case of Odessa, they told me that if 3 men there, so the current mayor of Odessa, Trukhanov, right, thank you, Trukhanov, then Kivalov, and the third one was Markov, who was the head of the Rodina party. If these 3 men actually coordinated their efforts, Odessa might have been produced a very different outcome. So it might have been ultimately ended up on the separatist side if these 3 men coordinated their resources. And in the case of Kharkiv, Kernes and Dobkin were the 2 men who ultimately decided, for whatever reason, to side with the new Ukrainian authorities. Odessa, I think, is the case where popular counter-mobilization played a much bigger role than in the case of Kharkiv. At least in the case of Kharkiv, I could not trace. I met a number of activists who were on the Ukrainian side for Ukrainian unity, but from what I understood, the level of mobilization was smaller in Kharkiv, and so I think in Kharkiv, elite choices, both Avakov and Kernes played a more decisive role. In the case of Odessa, I think popular mobilization was very significant, but I also talk about Trukhanov's strategies, and it was clear that Trukhanov did not see these separatists or militants, whatever you call them, as allies, as potential allies. And I actually managed to interview a couple of people very influential on the separatist side in Odessa, and they said that we tried to engage Trukhanov and we failed. Trukhanov made his bet to become a mayor of Odessa through direct elections because there were early elections announced in Kharkiv in May, and that ultimately shifted his strategy to cooperating and supporting the Ukrainian unity. But I think it's also important to recognize the structural differences in the region itself. Both in the case of Odessa and in the case of Kharkiv, I showed that there was no diffusion of this kind of separatist movement into the smaller towns that happened in Donbas. Most of these towns were very, they did not have large-scale protests, they did not have attempts to capture government buildings, etc. While the difference in Donbas was the simultaneity of the separatist capture in these multiple towns, which allowed ultimately to take over the entire region. Because it's one thing to capture the regional center, but it's okay. You capture that regional center. What are you going to do next, right? And so the ability to mobilize people in multiple towns at the same time was crucial for the capture of Donbas, and that was not possible for structural reasons and other reasons, local preferences in the case of Odessa and Kharkiv.
Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes, in the back. Gulnaz,
Yes, continuing on the Gulnaz. First of all, Serhiy, thank you very much for writing and doing this research and writing the book. I think this micro-level, empirical, sort of not secondary research study is really, really important. And all the names that you've given on Kharkiv case, Daria Platonova did similar study, who was also pointing out the role of elite choices in Kharkiv. So that all sounded very resonant. From what you have described just now in terms of the quickness in the scope of establishing control, it clearly relied on the opportunity to mobilize people in the small towns and settlements, right? Which tells me that the resistance strategies or individuals who uptook resistance to separatism mentality or position were more of an exception. And tell me if I'm wrong. And you've mentioned that you've spoken in Dobry Pil, for example, right, where there are cases of whole cities that went in the direction of resistance. What's your sense of both individual and structural explanations, individual level, but also structural level explanations for when individuals would tend to pick up more resistance-based strategy? At the individual level, age, who is more patriotic towards whole of Ukraine as opposed to the region or proximity to Russia, but also structural level explanations for why some towns. And I guess structural level you gave already, that if you were proximate to that centers of Strelkov, and so then that explains it. But at the individual level, maybe that would be a more pointed question.
Okay, thank you. So the explanation for variation, I don't pretend to make any original contribution. Statis Cal was the logic of civil war, where he talks about the importance of coercive control, and I clearly saw that in these cases, because in the case of Dobropila, a man who invited me and whom I interviewed, one of the leaders of the self-defense and organizers of self-defense, he said the following. He said, if we did not have a close presence of the Ukrainian armed forces, and so there was a brigade deployed not inside Dobropila, but on the outskirts of Dobropila, was deployed there. He said, had we not had the presence of this brigade on the outskirts, and we knew that we are 30 minutes away from these guys, and they can always back us up, I probably would have gone to Kiev and joined the volunteer brigade there. But since there was a coercive presence, at least a backup possibility of the Ukrainians, I ultimately made the choice to organize. In another case, in the case of Svatova, the distance and the fact that it was so distant away from any major centers of resistance played a very significant role. which was based on the choices of primarily the mayor himself. And so when you ask about individual factors, the fact that the mayor of Svatov was not part of the Party of Regions patronage system, and was actually not a member, one of the very few mayors who were not members of the Party of Regions, very critical of Yanukovych, played a very significant role. Because as they show, the patronage system in Party of Regions, it was started being dismantled after the fleeing of Yanukovych, but most of the members of the Party of Regions, by inertia, were withdrawing themselves from the process. They were not willingly active to contribute to the resistance. Even in those towns where there were civic activists who they could have supported. So the choice of people from the Party of Regions side, like for example, in the case of Konstantinivka, there was a member of the Party of Regions, the secretary of the city council, who told me that I was there until these guys showed up in my office and told me that I have to choose sides. So he was trying to work and govern the town, even though there were militants there, but he was not actively resisting them. When they showed up in my office and put a gun on my table, I packed up and left next day. But this was the choice that he made. Instead of organizing resistance or finding people who would, he decided to just withdraw from the process. But a mayor of Svatov, for example, brought in large landowners of that town, because it was a majorly agricultural town, and these individuals financed the self-defense group. In a number of other cases, like in the case of the Dobropina, most of the members of this self-defense group were entrepreneurs, local businessmen. The leader, by the way, of this self-defense group was ethnic Russian, who was born in Russia and came to Dobropina and said, I'm ethnic Russian, but I don't want these Russians to be in my town. that was the I remember he said that. But many of them were entrepreneurs, and for them it was also about their property and the threat that these militants posed to them and their businesses. So there were, I think, multiple, on the individual level, multiple explanations, but I think that the significance of coercive presence, both of the separatists, the distance, and of the Ukrainian side was decisive.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, you get a sense of...
Sorry, you can introduce yourself.
My name is Jim Biggis. I'm retired Foreign Service, and I worked as an observer with OSCE in Kramatorsk from 2015 to 2020. You get a sense of to what extent the Opolchensi organized themselves, or they were a creation of the Russian security services?
The concept of Opolchensi might have been a creation of the Russian security services. So the idea that we Opolchenia meaning some kind of a grassroots militia units and formations. But as I already alluded, many of the people who were leaders of individual militia units, in the case, for example, of Drushkivka, or in the case of Konstantinivka, or Kramatorsk, these were people who became active and organized self-defense groups already prior to the emergence of the Russian security services in the region, or at least their active presence. And they were organized primarily for domestic political reasons. Right? They were organized by the local mayors, by the local city officials, because they received orders from Yanukovych to counter-mobilize against Maidan. Right? So the security services, in the extent to which they were involved in forming this Opolchenia, they were basically working with the material that was already there, that was already prepared for them.
Right, so organized by this Party of Regions.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, but
Michael Asher, I'm with The Insider. Kind of a follow-up to that. This is not an analytical book, this is a novel, but I want to get your take on how closely this describes the Russian motivation. Right. So there's a passage where an official from Moscow is speaking with the commander on the ground and says, the leaders of the local militia don't understand. They pursue naive objectives like victory, but you're not that stupid, are you? You understand that war is a process and that its goals extend far beyond military success. The fact is that it's important for us never to succeed completely, never to let our conquest become definitive. What would Russia do with 2 new regions? We took back Crimea because it was ours, but our motivation here is different. What we're aiming for is not conquest, but chaos. The world has to see that the Maidan revolution plunged Ukraine into anarchy. If you make the mistake of trusting the West, that's how it always ends. The West drops you at the first bump in the road, and you're left all on your own to deal with the demolished country. How closely does that fit?
Based on my interviews with Putin, yeah, I think it's one possible motivation. I'm still doubtful that the Russians did not exclude the possibility of full takeover of Donbas. I think they might have actually aimed for even more than that. But this passage suggests that the main goal was to undermine the new Ukrainian government, and it was very tactical. That basically exposed the weakness of the post-Maidan government. I think that that's possible. Maybe that was part of the strategy. Remember, there were different people who were involved in decision making. But we should not discount the ideological component. And the ideological component associated with April 2014 press conference of Putin, where he talked about Novorossiya for the first time, and said Novorossiya is historically our region. For whatever reason, Ukrainians got it, but we want it back. Right? He didn't say we want it back, but he meant it. And from then on, you have the emergence of this ideological, Zheritol, I'm not, is here, imaginary, geopolitical imaginary, that's how Zheritol calls it, right? In the minds of many imperialists in Russia, who start to join this movement for these ideological reasons. And that ideological movement only gained in strength. And what we're seeing now in Russia today with the Zets, that goes back to this imagination that Putin woke up in many Russians with his statement.
Did you read about Dmitry Kazakov by any chance? This is maybe a separate question.
Did I write about
Dmitry Kazakov?
Remind me, who is?
He was an advisor to Zaharchenko.
No.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, please.
Nice to meet you, Serhiy. We used to study together, struggle together. I think the war is not only about physical dominance or hegemony. It's also about psychological hegemony, right? So you travel around Donbas, right? Do you have any sense that who is winning the minds of people?
Back in 2018, 19, when I was there,
No, yeah.
who was winning the minds of
Yeah,
people?
yeah. And also, another thing was, you mentioned, intimate violence, right? Intimate
Yes.
violence, right? From my experience from Korea, and that is the tragic aspect of war. For example, in Korea, whenever there was a war, the brother, one brother goes to communism in North Korea, and the younger brother goes to anti-communist. So it's quite tragic aspect. It's not the news in my mind.
So the question, who was controlling minds, that was also one of the surprises for me when I was talking to the locals. And that is, even though by 2018 and 19, it was clear, the devastation that this conflict brought to the region already, in terms of both divided families that you just mentioned, the destruction of economic resources of this region, and so on. And it was clear that the Russians are very much involved in many ways. There is no doubt about it. But from a large number of conversations I had, especially with the people quote unquote pro-Ukrainian, in other words, who are were explicitly participating in the Ukrainian unity or demonstrations and mobilization, they felt that they were in minority. And that idea was constantly conveyed to me in multiple towns and interviews, and I actually talked about that in the introduction when I talked to a security officer in Mariupol, whose flag was in Mariupol on the Ukrainian flag, was on the balcony of his house, of the building where he lived, his apartment was. And when I arrived, he invited me to his apartment, and I said, wow, I can immediately see where you live. And he says, yes, you know why I have it? I just want to irritate all the separs living all around me. Which tells you something about the sentiments. From the standpoint of a security officer, this is not my view, it was an SBU officer who told me, and I was just completely unbelievable. Like, he tells me explicitly. And he says, this is another thing that he said to me, he said, believe me, if Russians arrive, and they will arrive at some point, most of the people will be on the Russian side.
Mm.
That man, by the way, died in Azovstal 2 months later, or 3 months later. This is the man I discussed in the very introduction to my book, died fighting with the Russians who he knew they were coming to take over Mariupol. I think in many other towns there was less of a sense that there was this widespread separatist support, at least I did not get that, and there was also, Donbas is different, there was a variation, like Pokrovsk is very different from Kramatorsk or Konstantinivka, but many of the activists certainly felt in minority, and they also felt resentful of Poroshenko for not cleaning the local governments, because they told me that many of the people who worked in the local government in 2018 were the same people who were openly or covertly supporting the separatist side, and Poroshenko just, there were no criminal investigations, so the only investigations that happened were of individuals who stood on checkpoints, like low-level guys. These guys were investigated and received criminal convictions. But people in the local government who were responsible for political things and maybe distribution of grants, falsification of election results, something that's useful for Mr. Poroshenko, might have been in 2018. These guys were never persecuted. There were also some exceptions. The mayor of Toretsk, Sliptsov, was ultimately jailed, but very few exceptions.
All right, we just have a couple minutes left. Maybe I'll just ask one final question, which, you know, at one point in the book you mentioned that the Russians didn't learn what had changed in Ukraine between kind of the 2014-2015 period and the full-scale invasion. And so I wonder if you could kind of elaborate on that. Like, what did they learn or not learn from this experience that might have played into how they conducted the 2022 full-scale invasion?
Yeah, so
what did they miss?
The conclusion that or rather this conclusion is made or is based on a report that many of us have read from RUSI, the British analytical think tank, which I think a few weeks before the full-scale invasion issued a detailed report about the preparations of the Russians to the invasion. And in this report, they detailed the extent of infiltration of local government offices by the Russians and the widespread collaboration that the Russians are expecting to happen in case they invade. And as I was reading this report, I was thinking back to the experience of 2014, and I was wondering to what extent it's realistic to expect that a person in Sumy or a person in even Kharkiv Oblast would official in these oblasts would respond similarly to the officials from the Party of Regents in Donbas. I was very skeptical, and it's very clear from the patterns of collaboration that we saw that in the south and in the north, the local involvement in initial stages of occupation was minimal, and the desire of the locals to engage in resistance right away, especially in the north, was quite significant, right? And so we know that in the first weeks of the invasion, one of the most important things that stopped the Russian convoys from going all the way to Kiev were the locals who were organizing and moving in mobile small groups and trying to hit these convoys with from what's the name? Mentats, right? The type of weapon, right? Which ultimately stopped these convoys. So there was both local mobilization on the ground that we did not see in the case of Donbas, greater readiness to fight back, to resist, to join volunteer groups that we did not see. And I think, and that's what I discuss also, is the general consensus that emerged in the, not consensus, but a large majority agreement within the Ukrainian society that Russia is ultimately responsible for the attempts to sustain these separatist movements and ultimately to continue the aggression. In 2014, in spring, there was a lot of confusion about Russia's role and misunderstanding of Russia's goals, right, on the ground. And so many of the people who recognized Russia was playing a role tried to explain it in benevolent terms, in the terms of a country that comes in with some kind of attempt to protect or support that type of cover-up that Putin was proposing through in his statements. People did not have any illusions about what Russians were trying to do in 2022. So I think it made a role, and of course the Zelensky effect. This is the Henry's book, the Zelensky effect. So the fact that you had a legitimate president who was willing to, who received the support from all parts of the country, was recognized as a legitimate president. There was no division, right? Donbas was also divided about the legitimacy of the new authorities. Here there was no division, and there was a recognition that if he leads, we will do our part. So, I fully agree with you.
Yeah. I didn't set him up for that. Anyway. All right. Well, actually, I just want to, before thanking our author and presenter, I just want to say if you're a student and you're attending, we have your names in a bowl here. We can raffle off one free copy of the book. So please come up right afterwards. But everybody, please join me in thanking Serhiy for a really wonderful talk.